This is Teachers Talk Radio, and you are listening live.
Hello, welcome to the Friday Twilight Show with me, Maxine H. It's the first show I've done for a few weeks, so it's really good to be back actually. So really excited tonight to be talking all things racial equity, and joining me shortly will be Unleashing Me himself, Sufyan Sadiq.
This is Teachers Talk Radio, and you are listening live. Tune in live at ttradio.org, or to join in the conversation, download the Podbean app and search Teachers Talk Radio. Follow the hashtag TTRadio. Tune in, talk it out with Teachers Talk Radio.
Really exciting to be back. Slightly nerve-wracking, I have to say, having taken a bit of a break. So really excited to be back here and to be joining you again on Teachers Talk Radio. And welcome to the Twilight Show with me, Maxine H, on Friday the 22nd of September. So this evening's show is all about racial equity. Hello, Claire. Really great to see you. Thank you for joining in. So really, really pleased to see you. And Claire, I've just been saying, really, really nervous. Having just joined again. Feels like the first show all over again, but I'm sure I'll get straight back into it. So this evening's topic of racial equity is a really, really tough one. And I'll be totally honest, it's something that I found quite hard to write about, and I find quite challenging to talk about. And I always believe in setting oneself a challenge. So here we go. So I was prompted really. My background in coaching, as you know, I've written a lot about barriers. So one of the things that I've found a most fascinating barrier is this whole barrier that is getting in the way of a significant percentage of the population in really achieving what they deserve to, and how they ought to get on. And if I just put a few statistics around that. So according to the 2021 census, 18% of the UK population were of black and or minority ethnic origin and identified as black or ethnic minority. Add to that 18%, or compare to that 18%, that only 6% of school leaders in the UK currently identify as black and minority ethnic. Now, that is a huge disconnect between 18% of the population and only 6% of school leadership. It's a massive disconnect, and something that we've got to tackle. And so that's why I've got Unleashing Me, Sufyan, joining us shortly, hopefully. He's juggling this around children's bedtimes, and so we're really pleased that he can join us. But he's going to talk to us about how well understood is this problem and what can we do about it. And I think it's going to be fascinating to hear what he's got to say. So I was prompted to write my blog, write the blog about racial equity, by reflecting on a fantastic event, #REN, the Racial Equity Network Dinner. It grew from a really small organisation going back, I think it was just a casual dinner hosted in Ampthill a few years ago, and it's grown now to an enormous event. 480 educators, largely people from the education world, and largely education leaders or teachers. 480 tickets apparently sold faster than Glastonbury, which is amazing. And attending that is what really prompted me to start to think about racial equity and the problems, the challenges that are faced by a significant number of people, and the fact that we don't have a society with racial equity. And there are so many barriers. And I'm totally honest. I'm honest in my blog, and I will be honest now. as a white British woman, I have to admit to not always being as absolutely acutely aware of the reality of the inequality of the system and the challenges faced by those identifying as black and minority ethnic. Um, the speakers at hashtag Rendon this evening isn't about advertising that event, but it is. I do just have to mention it really because it was really attending that event and talking afterwards that has really made those challenges totally acutely clear to me. But also presenting an optimism of how we can challenge and move towards a more equitable society. So, as I've said, 2021 census showed that 18% of the population in the UK are of a black, Asian, or mixed ethnic group. And only 6% of school leaders identify as black and minority ethnic. I mean, ironically, we are talking about the global minority, and 6% of the school leaders in the UK. And we think about those school leaders, people running schools, and they are such important role models. And if I think back to my own days, my own school days, um, as a woman, as a white woman, but as a girl, I was 15 before I'd ever really seen a woman in a senior position within a school. And it had taken all that time for me to be able to actually see a woman. And looking back now, I can realise just how pleased I was to see a female head teacher, a woman, quite a feisty woman, someone I identified with straight away. Um, and I really now looking back, I can see how important that was to me. And I wonder, would I have believed some 20 years later that headship was a possibility for me if I hadn't seen this role carried out so convincingly, so well, so passionately by someone that I identified with straight away? And I could probably, looking back now, when I first became a head, I I definitely saw myself as being a little bit like Mrs. Bagshaw. She was fantastic. Consciously or subconsciously, I hadn't realised quite how important that was. And thinking about children of black and minority ethnic backgrounds, how impactful might that lack of representation be? So, again, hearing those speakers for the last 2 years has really opened my eyes up to that. So, I'm going to invite Sufyan, who's joined us now. Thank you, Sufyan. Those of you who follow Twitter will know Unleashing Me really well, no doubt. And I'm just going to invite him to join and to talk to us this evening. So, Sufyan, welcome. I know you are doing this juggling, looking after your two lovely young children, and I know you are a hugely busy man with your role of Director of Talent at Chiltern Learning Trust. So I feel really privileged that you've joined us this evening on Teachers Talk Radio. And Sufyan, just while you were connecting there and while you were just joining in, I was just putting out those statistics about only 6% of school leaders identify as black and minority ethnic compared to 18% of the UK population. And you might have heard there as we were coming in, just talking about how I relate to that personally and bring things back to me as a white woman, having not seen until I was 15 someone female in a senior position in a school, and just thinking about the impact that that might be having on young people. So, Sufyan, can I join you to welcome us and say hello? I believe I've unmuted you.
Yeah,
Are you able to say hello? Hello, I can hear you.
uh,
Great to hear you, and thank you again for joining us, Sufyan.
it's an absolute pleasure, Maxine, and thank you for having me on. Can you hear me clearly?
I can
So,
hear you
and
very, very clearly. And I've got a message coming up here from Claire, who's joined as well. Claire from the ACB saying she can hear us and it's all
excellent.
working.
So excellent. So, for like you say, sadly, it's a statistic that is a reflection, and I think it's the fairest way to say is a reflection of the society we're in. And not only is the problem, we often hear about the problems in the police, we've heard about it in the army, we've recently heard about the spate of abuse that has been identified in English cricket and the reports. And this statistic is like every other statistic that we see across the board, which just goes to indicate that education is somehow not free of institutional systemic racism, because if it exists in so many other walks of life and all of our data suggests that we have serious problems, then it looks like we've got to accept we have serious problems.
And that certainly does make sense. And we often think about education as being forward thinking, about having these elements of political correctness, but education is such a lever to society and to changing society. And if that is going on everywhere else, and hearing things sadly about cricket, even cricket, and hearing about the police, that does seem indicative, doesn't it? And I must admit, it's not something that I was acutely aware of until fairly recent years. And now thinking, having trained and been teaching for 20 odd years, I have to put my hands up and saying this is something that I'm really thinking much more about now, more than I ever have before, Sophia. And it is thank you to some really good events such as those that you've put on and some of the things that are out there in the education world. But it's early days, isn't it? And
It's
it
very,
shouldn't be.
it's very early days, and I think George Floyd was a sociological milestone where it allowed us to check ourselves as a society, reflect as a society. The problem, I think, is the assumption made that just because we talk about racism and we put something on for Black History Month and we talk about and we've attended a course on inclusive curriculum doesn't free us of the burden of what exists in our organization, which is racism. The way we've got to challenge it is by working towards becoming anti-racists, and that will mean accepting the fact that racism exists in our schools, our institutions, our trusts, whatever the form of organization you're in. It's almost guaranteed that you're faced with that challenge. I often use that line where I say that don't tell my daughter that she can go and reach the moon when the chances of her in her primary school going 20 meters up the corridor and becoming a head teacher is nigh on impossible, let alone going on the moon. And that for us is where the real challenge is, where we're saying actually we want the very best for our children from diverse backgrounds. However, while saying we want the very best and we want them to do incredibly well, we're also guilty of not seeing talent when it doesn't look like us, when it doesn't speak exactly like us, when it doesn't behave like us, when it doesn't socially display characteristics or lifestyle choices that we have. We do not recognize that talent because when it's different and it doesn't fit our mold, we quickly switch off. And that's what we found in education. It's I often say that FTSE 100 have a statistic that there's more Chris's, more Roberts, more Marks, more Davids. Any one of those names, there'll be more CEOs in the top 100 companies with a name that like David or Robert than there are Black or Asian combined CEOs of FTSE 100 companies. So if you have the combined number of FTSE 100 company CEOs of 4, there'll be 7 Marks, 6 Davids. And the challenge we have in education is exactly the same. You can go up and down organizations, and what you'll find is that the profile of what you will find as CEOs, as head teachers, will be virtually identical. Once you have a ethnic minority head teacher or leader, the chance of surviving in leadership as an ethnic minority then becomes even more challenging, because success rates of survival are a bit like being a black manager in the Premiership, that actually the board has less appetite. So the number of black people being forced to sign non-disclosure kind of agreements is something that's quite well documented, because we'll give you money to be quiet, but you need to leave. And it covers a huge issue. That's a secondary issue, which we don't get to talk about, which is around the fact that just becoming ahead isn't easy. Staying ahead or staying a senior leader is difficult. I often say that I'm in a landscape where the thought of being a CEO, when I look at, I'm very driven. From those who know me,
Yes.
very goal orientated, but I also know that I've got to be realistic about dreams and ambitions because of the way I look. And that's a reality of the world and the life I live. I look a certain way, I belong to a certain faith, and my faith isn't the flavor of the month, and it's not something deemed positive in British society. It's not, I won't get the same treatment as my peers. My ability is irrelevant in reality. If you look at middle leaders, you'll see schools where those churning out brilliant results will be from an ethnic minority background, but they can't progress. But their counterparts come in below them and stream past them with ease, but we're unable to identify and call it out for what it is, which is that we have institutional issues around accepting the fact that when the talent doesn't look like us, we struggle with it. We're okay with you being brilliant teachers. So I always, one of the criteria I always ask people to say is, we tend to say to people, when we're looking at what is great performance, we either say academic ability, so look at that measure. We then say outcomes and performance. So let's look at somebody's results and their proven track record. Uh, let's look at somebody's experience. How many years have they got under the belt? And say, right, they've got the proven results. They've got, let's look at mastery in the craft of teaching within the class, because you don't get to display necessarily leadership very early on. People progress in education because they're good teachers and they tend to progress. But if you look at all of these factors, if you're ethnic minority, you can be a doctor, you can be somebody who possesses masters, you can be somebody who has lots of educational qualifications behind you, but it makes no difference to your progression to leadership. You can be someone that's very experienced, and we see that across the system. Experienced leaders going up against people with next to no experience, not being able to get it. You can have the mastery and the art of being a brilliant educator with outstanding performance and outcomes, and that's not enough. So the question is, what do you have to do as a black, as an Asian, as an ethnic minority leader to be seen? And the difficulty is, that's what I don't know, because I think that's the white people problem. When I say
Yeah.
that, because it's, I can't
Yeah.
understand it, because I need somebody else to say to me, uh, either is I'm imagining this or it is a problem. And I think this is the conversation that white leaders and white people need to have in the educational landscape.
Well, certainly that's something. Looking at the 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 excellent Viv Grant, who's set up Integrity Coaching, who's starting to try to train white leaders as being the key to ending racism. Sufyan, it those statistics just don't add up to anything other than there must be racism in the system. And as an ex-head, that's a really difficult message. We're all very proud of our schools, and seeing that and hearing that is difficult, and we need to accept it. I wonder how well understood you think the problem is. How well aware are people, school leaders, the white folk, of that problem and
So
of those
I,
statistics and the
so I,
reality?
I think an example I could give is we used to look at safeguarding almost. Let's use the crude example of a pedophile, and you've heard those people say, "Look, just because somebody looks a certain way and they're wearing an anorak coat or whatever it is, those descriptors of how you identify someone and say that's what they look like." And you can't do that because you need education around safeguarding. You need to make sure you're constantly alert to it. You've got to accept the fact that every institution is susceptible, vulnerable to predators coming in. Hence why we all go over and beyond to
Yeah,
make sure we safeguard our children, our young people, our institutions by doing the relevant checks and balances and so on and so forth. The problem with racism is everyone assumes it's a problem that doesn't exist within their household, within their school. It's an evil in society, but what people don't say, it's an evil in my institution. Now,
yeah,
with safeguarding, what we do accept is we are equally vulnerable to be exploited, to have young people taken advantage of. I would say again, if we use that same proactive brain where we say, am I
yeah,
saying to myself, my organization is equally vulnerable to racism? I'm susceptible to allowing practices to occur unless I put systems and processes in place to prevent that happening, unless I have regular education, training, and updates, unless I challenge it where I see it, encourage people to call it out when they see it, give people safe spaces for calling it out when it happens, give victims the right to come forward and report it. Unless we say that, every school I go to in the country thinks it's a real evil in society, but not an evil they recognize in the organization, but one that exists in society. So, what that means is no school thinks they have an issue of racism. Every leader says, I recruit based on the quality of the candidate. And I'll say this, and I'll say it very happily on record. I do huge amount of recruitment. I'm very prominent in the recruitment landscape. I get to see a lot of recruitment practices nationally. And I will say to you, recruitment is inherently racist within education. When you have people that recruit in their own image, that is, you could go to institution after institution and see the similarities that are borne out between the leader and the teams that they recruit, and the checks and balances that governance do not exist, and people are filtered out because of their names, which is a fact and it happens. People are filtered out because of their ethnicity and it happens. People are filtered out if they've got an accent that sounds remotely foreign. People like me are filtered out, and I always say this, I challenge anyone to take part in a social experiment where I can apply for a headship and listen to your governors, listen to your staff, because I'm very happy to present. I'm very happy to teach a lesson and do an assembly and meet staff. I'm very happy to do the interview. But I am almost certain that in many schools, people will say, Sufyan, you'd be great in Luton. You'd be
yes.
great in Birmingham. You'd be great in Bradford. But I'm not sure he's right for this community.
My
So
goodness.
a white man is right for all communities. But Sufyan, you're just a great role model for Pakistani kids, no other kids. Why?
And that's the real crux of it, isn't it? And I think you've said, I mean, that whole thing, and knowing you really well, crikey, we would be absolutely privileged to have you anywhere as a school leader, Sophie, and knowing you well, knowing how skilled you are. That just calls me to think on two things really. So first, like the safeguarding principle, that absolute focus on it could happen here, and not thinking about it's just something that's happening there in society, and that's really interesting to allow that and to really try and to nail that focus on that it could happen here. And the other thing that you've just said, just coming back to that thing about recruiting in your own image, our own biases, and our own um, like everything that we think comes through our own lens of who we are, our own background and experience, and that thing about the image of ourselves. Thinking as a coach, that's something that we are trained when we're listening and we're working with coaching to try and put aside. And I wonder to what extent people really in their hearts are able to do that. And it is logical that that is a thing that's there, and it's so vital that we know it, call it out, and change it, because this inequity is just horrendous, Sophie, and hearing it from you, that's it really is something that we've got to fight. So it is coming down to calling out to the white folks, the people like me, the Adrian Rogers, and the people that are there in the system. I think I'm hearing you say there.
And I say the agents of change cannot be the black and Asian people in the system, because uh, it's almost again saying, for me, racism is a form of abuse. It's an abuse that I've suffered most of my life. For you to then say that as the victim of the abuse, I'm the one who should be leading the fight,
Yeah.
uh, is in itself quite painful. To how does the system change? The system changes through agents of change that are more than just allies. Allies is someone who's going to stand by me, but I need someone to fight for me rather than just stand by me, because somebody's got to say, right, I'm going to call this out because that does not seem right. That person wasn't selected for that job, and that person wasn't selected for that job, and we're now making a narrative fit the biases that we created, and we're perpetuating this endless cycle of black and brown people feeling incredibly demotivated. I often say to people, when when you finish an interview, be very, very mindful about what they say in feedback. Listen to the feedback, reflect, unpick the feedback to the things that you genuinely can develop, but also remember that there are so many biases at play when you're going for a job. And I say to you, I'm extremely confident. I'm a very comfortable communicator. I like socializing a lot. I like networking. But I go into events and I am able to quickly pick up the prejudices that exist with those around me. Whether they know they're being prejudicial or not is a different thing. But it's a bit like, we're going to talk about X, Y, and Z, and now Sufyan's come. We're going to quickly talk about cricket or curry, because apparently that's the only areas I can offer quality conversation in. And somebody's kind of almost inadvertently shown their hand around the biases that go in their brain. I always say, for example, I run one of the most successful teaching schools in the country, and that's a
You do
huge
indeed.
huge honor, for the fact that I have a team of brilliant people that are exceptionally talented. But if you look at the scale of the operation of what we run, if you then look at institutions and conferences, that if you are going to invite, so I get invited to conferences, often the invite is, Sufyan, come on and talk about EDI issues, fine. But why can't Sufyan talk about the areas that you have barricaded off for intellectual superiority that belongs to white people? Why can't I talk about teaching and learning? Why can't I talk about teacher development when I run one of the largest teacher development organizations in the country? Why don't I get a seat at the table to talk about developing teachers? Because actually, even when you let us in the room, you tell us where to sit in the room and which corner we stand in, because your box is behavior, or your box is community, or your box is EDI. Stay within those boxes, because this real meaty business of pedagogy and practice and the intellectual stuff of leadership and strategy, that's our stuff. So when we're going in to trying to let you in, you know what the schools are going to say? We've got a great guy, a black guy on our team. He's fabulous with the kids. Whoa, couldn't have guessed that, could I? Because he's just good for the banter with the kids, or he's really good for behavior management and he's got great rapport. Why aren't we saying that actually some of the best educators we've met, some of the best pedagogical thinkers we've met, yeah, actually that person should have a seat at the table because they're brilliant in the classroom. And I think that exists whether it's done maliciously or not. We have that problem within the systems that even when we let people into the room to talk about an issue, we let them talk about issues that we want them to talk about. We let them lead in areas we reckon they can lead on. But what we're struggling with is the idea and notion that Black and Asian people can be CEOs. That's kind of a notion too far. Black and Asian people can be head teachers. We're struggling with deputy heads. The statistics are shocking, but actually we're all right around assistant head for maths, assistant head for science. We'll take you on because actually you've got proven credentials within the class. We need you to fix our maths and English. We'll take you on for behavior, uh, and you'll work really hard. But I don't think you're going to progress because we're still going to bring in our mates for progression because our mates look like us, and when we see them, we think they're great because we see ourselves, and because we think we're great, and every human has that thing about how amazing they are. They look for people that are like them and say, "Oh my God, they're great."
So I think we've got to look in the mirror, all of us white folk, and we've got to look in the mirror and we've got to reflect on everything that we're doing. And that is huge. And I've heard that assumption many times before about the black teacher who's good with banter, who will be great and will be a great role model for a particular group of students, for boys, for black boys. And thinking about what you've just said then about maths and science and some of those assumptions, they are real. They are out there, Sufyan. And how do we challenge that? And how do we change it?
I think I see my role as a professional pain in the arse, and I'm happy. I'm happy with that role. I'm happy to challenge the system. I'm happy to call it out. But
Yeah,
I can, and the benefit is I can because I'm in an organization that's supportive.
yeah,
Secondly, I, I'm in a position of leadership where I run a division, an institution that is highly successful, and therefore I'm granted the blessings of a platform that allow me to challenge it. The average bod in education from a black and Asian background cannot say and do what I'm doing without absolutely getting lynched for it at work, challenged. I've had numerous occasions where people have said to me they're offended by what I say, they don't like what I say, they feel uncomfortable with what I say. I've had people complain about me speaking in places, and I'm okay with it because that's my intention.
mm,
I don't want to walk away thinking I delivered something and everyone was really comfortable. Well, actually, if there's a problem, the biggest problem is people are comfortable being racist. Then I want to be the one that makes them uncomfortable being racist. And so I'm okay with people not enjoying it, not liking it, not and complaining or whatever it may be. But I'm afforded that by the institution, by the backing, and by the fact that I'm in a very fortunate position. So I would say up and down, one of the things I see is in the next week or so, we're going to do Black History Month. And people are going to pull out pictures of Muhammad Ali and Nelson Mandela and Usain Bolt and Jay Z and Beyonce. And do all the stereotypical polarizing us, not showing all Americanized black culture, not showing anything, or depicting the slavery as somehow that's the only contribution that black people have made to society, is the period of slavery, which only highlights what went wrong by this country more than any other country, and it's probably more of a self reflection of how hideously poor we were as a nation,
Yeah.
uh, rather than anything positive. When are we going to say, right, actually, to get Black History Month right, it shouldn't be the one black member of staff leading the assemblies and doing things. It shouldn't be about the one black member leading the Equality and Diversity Committee. It has to come from the very top. And the organization and its leaders need to identify that unless they become the catalysts for change, change will never come. Unless they accept and identify that it is possible that I am racist. And I think I would implore you to
Yeah.
do the same, Maxine, because unless we all say, have I been biased
Yeah.
towards people before? And we will all remember and think of occasions where we have. But
Yeah.
it's far better being that person that says, I'm going to ask myself the question, am I susceptible to this? Have I done this before? Do I feel like this? When I meet people that look really different, am I at ease around them? Am I uncomfortable? When people talk to me about certain things, how do I feel? When I talk about different communities, am I okay sitting in the staff room and people are talking about refugees in a disparaging way, migrants in a disparaging way, Roma children in a disparaging way? Do I sit there and listen and not challenge when I know that if they're saying this, the chances of that being borne out in acts of racism or stereotyping or excluding more black children from that school, punishing children of different backgrounds more easily and more harshly when because they look different, and picking issues out from them, treating parents at parents' evening in a patronizing, in a condescending way because they're different or they come from a different background to us. And when interviewing teachers, yeah, or shortlisting, are we immediately looking for names and making bold assertions and assumptions that because of their background, surely they can't be a very good teacher? Unless we have those questions answered at the very top table of our institutions, unless each person doesn't say, the chances of me being racist are there, and I
Yeah.
believe it's better to start with the notion that we are all racist and then work down a deduction model of I'm let's try and not be racist, then say none of us are racist, and therefore it becomes nobody's problem. If everyone's introspective like that and reflective, we will get somewhere. If everyone listening says, I'm not like that. And it's not something I recognize in my friends, in my family. And I've never sat there in the pub or over Christmas dinner and listened to family blag on about how horrendous these migrants are and how this country's been ruined by all of these foreigners coming in. And I've not challenged it for being incorrect at times. I've not challenged stereotypical views when they're talking about Meghan Markle in the most disparaging way. I've never wrong with me.
I think that's absolutely fascinating and absolutely spot on. So we start off by looking at ourselves, and if we have, and inherently, the likelihood is everybody has a racist tendency and has been racist at some point. We take it, we own it, and then from that point, we can start to challenge ourselves, particularly those of us who are in positions of leadership. But really, everybody, I think that's what you're saying, Sufyan, isn't it?
Yeah, I think that's the easiest action. It doesn't require strategy. It doesn't require governance discussions. It requires nothing. It's ask yourself the question, are you a racist?
When have I been biased? When have I stood by and listened to something and not directly challenged it? Thank
Exactly.
you. Sufyan, I'm aware you've got some youngsters. There's just one thing I want to challenge, and that's you say you can say all this and be a professional nuisance just because you're part of Chiltern and so on. Can I also just add a few things about your track record? There's not everybody organises an event and gets the tickets to sell faster than Glastonbury, Sufyan, and makes it just such a tremendous evening. And at the hashtag Ren Dinner, it is amazing, and hearing those speakers is a real catalyst for change. So you are doing so much. So
Thank you
thank
very
you
much.
very much. And yes, you're absolutely right. Hugely successful teaching school. Um, director of talent, Sufyan, finding amazing teachers and other staff for schools. You bring so much to that organisation. So every
Thank
bit
you
that
very
you
much.
get from them is really very much appreciated. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And I know you've got two young children to get to, and I certainly, having met your daughter, really hope that everything, and your wonderful little boy as well, and just really want this to be right for them and for everybody else from an ethnic minority background. So thank you so much
Thank
for
you.
being
Thank
with
you
us
very
this
much.
evening. Thank you.
Thank you.
And please come over and see the animals again
I
sometime
will
soon,
do. I
Sophia.
will do. Thank
Thank
you.
you. Thanks ever so much. Bye bye. Well, a huge thank you to Sophie in there. And my goodness, that was really quite challenging listening. Sufyan describes himself as a pain in the arse, pain in the backside, and for making some of those challenging statements to us, to the white folk. And that's not easy listening, that level of reflection. And as 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 a coach, that's one of the things that we do learn to do a little bit, actually, to look and recognize what bias we have, and when we're talking to people, what judgments are we making. And I've learned some really interesting things about myself, and hearing that from Sufyan, that's not easy listening. And as any others, if there's any school leaders listening, to hear that message and likening it as well to safeguarding, and that the good practice to always think it could happen here. Good practice with racism and with anti-racism is to think not just it could happen here, but one step beyond it. It almost certainly is happening here at some point, and that is very difficult, I think, for any school leaders, but absolutely vital if we're going to move on, and if we're going to really make those steps forward. And I've met Sufyan's little girl, and the fact that there would be any doubt that she can't have the most successful life is just totally wrong. I'm going to take us to the news just now and to our advertisers.
This is Teachers Talk Radio, and this is Teachers Talk Radio News.
RAC remains the top education story across many media outlets, with the BBC focusing on the impact the issue is having on universities across the UK. The news website refers to closures of lecture theatres, science labs and student unions. So far, 14 universities have told the BBC that they have closed or partially closed areas containing the reinforced autoclaved aerated concrete. Some lectures have had to be relocated, and a small number of universities have had to find alternative accommodation for students, as halls of residence have also been affected. This has placed additional pressures on universities already facing housing shortages, with charity Unipol suggesting that student housing shortages are going to get worse in some cities. Student numbers are growing, but the number of new rooms is tumbling. This is largely due to high building costs, older buildings falling into disrepair, and now RAC concerns are adding to the issue. Last week, the DfE published the list of 147 schools in England built using the concrete. 6 unions have now written to Education Secretary Gillian Keegan, asking a series of urgent questions. The BBC says that Essex is the county in England with the most affected schools, with 25 closed, partly closed, or making alternative arrangements. Prime Minister Rishi Sunak has dismissed suggestions that he was at fault for the concrete crisis. During Prime Minister's question time, he said his government had acted decisively, whilst opposition leader Sir Keir Starmer referred to him as Captain Hindsight. In Wales, only 2 schools have so far been affected by RAC, but First Minister Mark Drakeford said inspections were ongoing. In Scotland, Humza Yousaf has outlined his plans for the coming year, with a heavy focus on expanding childcare provision, saying it is the best way to support families. This plan includes the recruitment of 1,000 more childminders by 2026. Free childcare hours are being extended to 2-year-olds across the country. There will be a pilot of expanded care from 9 months to the end of primary in 6 local authority areas, and free school meals for P6 and P7 pupils moves forward. But those in receipt of the Scottish Child Payment will receive them first by 2024, with others following by 2026. Last week, Mr Yousaf also commented on the issue of banning single-use vapes, and linked this to the comments made about young people using vapes too often. He stated that the government will consult on curbing the sale of disposable single-use vapes, including consulting on an outright ban. According to The Guardian, South Korean teachers have staged walkouts over harassment by parents and students. Thousands of staff attended a rally in Seoul demanding better protection after a number of teacher suicides. Teachers are being increasingly vocal about their experiences of maltreatment, including being accused of child abuse after disciplining students. Around 15,000 teachers attended a rally last week, and some schools had to temporarily close due to a lack of staff. As of June 2023, 100 school teachers had died by suicide in the country since 2018. The current Education Ministry blamed the current situation on previous governments, saying that they had overemphasised students' human rights over teachers' rights. Finally, The Guardian also reports that a city in Japan is tackling a rise in truancy with the help of robots. 2 schools in Kumamoto have purchased mechanical assistants to help children regain confidence in dealing with teachers and their peers. It is hoped the robots will encourage children to attend classes remotely and eventually coax them back in person. The robots will be equipped with microphones, speakers and cameras. Students learning remotely will be connected to the robots via laptops, allowing them to attend and take part in discussions. The robots will not be confined to classrooms, but be free to roam so pupils can take part in other events and enjoy social times remotely too. Japan, like many countries, including the UK, is facing a rise in the number of pupils refusing to go to school since the pandemic. Could robots be the key to improvement? This has been your Teachers Talk Radio News with Joe Fox.
This is 2 Minute Tech with Steve Woods, your tech briefing on Teachers Talk Radio.
Hello, this week we've all returned to work and I'm going to discuss the old argument of digital or paper diary. For every argument for going digital, there's a counter argument for not, and vice versa. You can access a digital diary from anywhere, on any device, but if you don't have a signal, it's useless. A paper diary can't get hacked, but it can be picked up and read if left lying around. You get the point. I personally like a digital diary as it suits the way I work. I can add links to online meetings, add notes and attach documents. I can see my day, week, month, year at the click of a button, and the most useful thing for me is I get reminder notifications. One thing to consider if moving digital this year is policies on phones in your school, as this is the most likely way you'll access it on the move. And probably most importantly, if you're using your phone, will you be able to resist the notifications from other apps or emails you see when you switch it on to use it? Cost doesn't really apply as a factor because you probably already have a phone capable of running a digital diary. But work-life balance may need to be considered as the diary is there 24/7. This can, however, be remedied by using Do Not Disturb settings for notifications. In the end, it's a personal choice. Are you paper or digital? Let us know at TT Radio Official. I'm Steve Woods, and that was 2 Minute Tech.
2 Minute Tech with Steve Woods, your tech briefing on Teachers Talk Radio.
And hello, I'm back again. Back in after the news. So quite a challenging time for teachers overall. And again, just listening about how difficult teaching is at the moment and hearing some of that really difficult stuff on the news about how hard things are actually for teachers, then it's really, really important, I think, even more important again than before, because we're thinking about black and ethnic minority teachers and how difficult we've just heard from Sufyan times are for them. Adding that into the other difficulties that we've got here for teachers overall, this is a real time for us in education. And myself, I still work in schools and support schools. It is a time that we really need to be working together. I think absolute vital time to be able to be actually thinking. So some of the key things then that we heard from Sophia were about that bias that is in all of us, that is there where we sometimes feel uncomfortable with people who don't look like us and don't sound like us. And again, really thinking, um, really thinking about recruitment and about how we treat colleagues. I've just read Claire's note that said about how relevant her thoughts are here about recruitment. So again, Claire says, thank you, Claire, for commenting. I'd be really interested in anything anybody else has um, got to say on this, where she's just commented that thinking about recruitment and people who list experience overseas and discussion about how this is relevant. Do they have the knowledge? So much to offer, if even if experience is different, should be celebrated and embraced, Claire says. So yeah, just because people haven't been in the same system doing the same things, it doesn't mean that experience isn't relevant. And sometimes I think when we talk about experience, some people could have done the same thing year in, year out and not really developed it, moved it on, and taken it to be something that's very fascinating or that is any better. So really important to think like that. So just going back and thinking about some of the speakers and some of the things that I wrote about in my blog on racial equity, echoing what Sufyan had said about some of the real life experiences that some of the speakers I heard at the Rend event and that I've spoken to before that and since. I actually find, in a way, I did start when I was first thinking, finding it finding it surprising to think that some of these things are still happening in the 21st century. And then when I think again and I listen to Sufyan speak and I hear about the reality of our world at the moment and how much racism is actually out there, we probably can't be surprised that it's happening in schools. And that key thing, that key message about it could be happening here, it probably is. And owning that and being honest and really looking in the mirror and thinking about our own views and our own bias is just so vital. So some of the leaders that I've spoken to and that I heard spoke really clearly about being regularly passed over for promotions and seeing people of white backgrounds progressing much quicker than they had, even when they'd been there longer or they've actually got relevant experience, or being told they don't have enough experience when they really know, and being given less opportunity to lead on initiatives. And some of the black leaders who were talking were there saying that they'd had to prove themselves so much more, that they'd actually had to be better than their white counterparts to make the same level of achievement. And Sufyan spoke about the classic example for black teachers, particularly black men, is being told you can handle the naughty kids. I see you more as a pastoral type person. Teaching and learning isn't the right fit for you. Yet we've got some people who are fantastic at curriculum. And, we talked to Sufyan and he's been here. I'm really mindful that I've invited him on to talk about racial equity or the lack of. Whereas He can talk about recruitment. He can talk about running a really successful teaching school. But I'm glad that he's spoken so passionately about racial equity this evening. But we do recognise that there is so much about so much more to him. So some fascinating things here. And one of the key messages is that it is about white leaders, white people in the system who can really make a difference. So that's making me think about Black History Month that's coming up. So we're on the 22nd of September today. So we'll be putting the plans together for Black History Month. So I wonder how many of us will go back into school and just look at what is on the curriculum, what is on the schedule for Black History Month. Have we got the black teacher? And it may well be that we only have one or two black and ethnic minority teachers. Have we got the one black teacher leading on it? Or have we got somebody white leading on that, really putting themselves forward as a catalyst for change? What are we teaching? Is it all that stereotyped, Americanized stuff and a story of slavery? Or is it something really different, really worthwhile, and actually really causing us to do that reflection and look at ourselves and look back at our own biases and to think about that much more carefully? I wonder about Black History Month, what we'll be doing. And it's certainly caused me to think about going into the schools that I work with and support at the moment to dig into that a little bit more. Again, Claire's just asked a really good question. Do you think people don't realise they're being racist? They will say, I'm not racist because they don't use certain words, etc. They don't realise about things like cricket curry example that Sufyan gave. Claire, I agree with you totally. And I think because it is such a powerful issue, that whole idea of racism, that somebody speaking out and actually admitting that they have racist views, or that they do have some they're aware of some stereotypes that they've made themselves or some assumptions, makes it all the harder. So I think people, and I think white people, just shut down, deny it, because it is quite uncomfortable to dig in and actually look at your own beliefs, assumptions, and behaviours. And that feels really uncomfortable. You know, I'm just asking myself the questions as we sit here that Sufyan asked us to think about and to reflect on. And that's really uncomfortable. So it is much easier just to say, I'm not racist, and just think that that's as narrow as not using key words or not using racist language. To really think, am I anti-racist, is much more difficult, I think. Again, we're really fortunate to hear some really good speakers just before the summer, and I was really fascinated by Professor Paul Miller, who also made a strong statement about racism. He says it's personal, it's institutional, it's systemic. Let's all take a common enemy approach to racism. And I think that common enemy approach does mean that we've got to all start looking at ourselves. Hannah Wilson, who's on Twitter as at ethical_leader, she gave us a call to action and said, let's disrupt and dismantle. Allyship is not enough. And Sufyan said just the same this evening. Allyship isn't enough. Just standing by, supporting isn't enough. Actually, we all need to be powerful disruptors. Again, Dr. Darren Wallace, fantastic speaker, one of the most intelligent, the clarity of speech, it's just fantastic. I heard him speak at length about the depth of change needed, and he explained that we must be deeply committed to racial equity. And he says we often hear that there's power in our diversity, but let me be clear about why it's powerful. And he went on to say, It's powerful when we stand together across lines of race, across lines of gender, and across lines of social class. Because when an issue gets mounted, the education of our children, for example, it cannot be relegated to simply being a black issue or a brown issue or a white issue. It cannot be relegated to being an issue just for girls or just for boys. It cannot be relegated to simply being an issue just for the working classes, but it is an issue for all of us. That's the power in our diversity. That's when we all stand together undivided. And I think that whole idea about standing together, about being undivided, is so important. Again, what an amazing speaker. Again, hearing the fantastic Luton MP, and without being political, I think we're probably not allowed to be political. I have to say, Sarah Owen, what a fantastic politician, with her sleeves rolled up, getting out into the community all the time. What a great role model. And she spoke of her own stories. And she actually said, please continue the fight because we're behind you all the way. And she spoke about the power of education and the importance of belonging. And again, we need to look at that belonging and what are we doing in schools to make sure that all children feel like they belong, and that's absolutely vital. And she went on to say, when people feel like they belong, they feel safe. When they don't feel like they belong, if they don't see role models who look like them, who sound like them, when they don't continually get the same level of treatment that all children get, they won't feel safe. So that's absolutely, absolutely vital. Again, just reading an article in The Guardian back in 2022 tells the story of 4 head teachers, and Josephine Ockenden, head of St Martin's in the Field High School for Girls in London, explained. My race became an issue very early in my career as a teacher, and I began to discover these subtle, covert barriers. I was often the only female teacher of colour, and I soon began to see the white teachers getting more encouragement, more support, and more mentoring than me. I was left to fend for myself. Whenever I put myself forward for promotion, I was told that I needed more experience. But they'd look at the white teachers who'd moved up, and I'd think they've got the same, if not slightly less experience than me. She went on to say, as I gradually worked my way up, I found that there was anything but a multicultural mix in the school at all. It stopped at middle leadership. After that level, school governors are the ones making the recruitment decisions. And as a governor, that really made me think. And again, thinking about those senior teacher decisions, and thinking about where I'm a board of governors, and the board isn't a diverse board, it's even more vital that we have some really clear, in-depth work on our own biases, so that we don't, if we come to the point of ever having to appoint a head, so that we don't make the mistake of appointing somebody because they look like us and sound like us. And again, as governors, that's absolutely vital. As whitehead teachers with senior teachers, that's absolutely vital to take that time and to look and reflect on ourselves. Someone that I was absolutely fascinated to hear from is actually one of Suffian's old teachers, and it's really, really interesting whenever Suffian is around Dr. Patrice Evans, who is the fantastic deputy head at Chorley Boys School, and again that's where Suffian himself went. And people are always like that, aren't they? When someone's been your teacher, quite often you'll find they're always a little bit sort of very, very respectful to them. Not that Suffian isn't respectful to everybody, but there is definitely something there that he really, really looks up to Dr. Patrice. And again, I'm going to finish tonight with a statement that I got from Dr. Patrice. Dr. Patrice said, I look at you right now and I smile. I'm heartened by the range of diversity in the room. You have each other. People will throw stones, but pick them up and build empires with them. And Dr. Patrice was talking to that whole room of people of black and ethnic minority background and white people that were there. And as Sufyan said, it's not just the people from black and ethnic minority backgrounds who need to do the work here. It is the white people, and it's the white people who really have that power and who can do that and can make those changes and do just as Dr. Patrice says. When people are throwing stones, pick them up and build empires with them. So I'm going to pause it there, and I'm going to thank you very much for listening this evening. And again, thank you ever so much for your comments this evening. And I know you'll join me in saying a huge thank you to Sufyan for joining us and for sharing not just his own experiences, but giving us some strong messages about what we have to do. And again, like Dr. Patrice says, pick up the stones that are thrown and build empires with them. People here, particularly white people, have got a really important role to play in being anti-racist. Allyship is not enough. Standing and supporting isn't enough. Looking at ourselves, really carefully analysing any of our beliefs, any of our biases, owning them, thinking about how we're going to act more positively, thinking about our behaviours is absolutely vital. So thank you very much once again to Sufyan, and thank you so much to all of you for listening. Good night.
You've been listening to Teachers Talk Radio. Tune in live and listen back at ttradio.org. We look forward to hearing from you next time on Teachers Talk Radio.